Hello YouTube, this is Neon. This is Compassionate Listening Part 6. This should be the last video in this series. So in Part 6, I'm going to talk about some of the consequences excuse me, of compassionate listening. One thing that I want to say is that if a person is talking about politics or religion, which in our society is not appropriate, it's not appropriate. Compassionate listening, the compassionate listener is not a hostage. Compassionate listening is not an opportunity for someone to use a listener, to hold his listener. Yo, I'm just stumbling over my words. Y'all playing games with me. Ooh. Compassionate listening is not an opportunity for the speaker to hold the compassionate listener hostage so that they could talk about politics or religion. It's not appropriate. So please don't take compassionate listening as that you have to listen to whatever anybody says and they can go on and on and on forever. It's not that. It's not that at all. At the same time, I would say that there are people who their religion's a big part of their life. Like, I'm not a fan of Buddhism. I don't hate Buddhism or dislike Buddhism, but I'm not a fan of it. I'm not going to follow it. But I know people who it's a big part of their life and they talk about it all the time. They know I'm not going to convert to Buddhism. So when they talk about Buddhism, I don't really get offended and I'm comfortable with them doing that. And I can compassionately listen to them. If somebody, like, I'm not a fan of President Trump at all. But if someone says something casually positive about him, I'm liable to listen. I'm probably not going to pick an argument with them. But if they go on forever about either their religion, which I'm not a fan of, or the Republican Party or President Trump, I will politely let them know that this subject I don't like, this subject matter, let's change topics and talk about something else. I don't want to talk about politics or religion or whatever. Okay? And same thing if a person's talking about their abuse that they survived or their traumatic experience. If it's too much for me for whatever reason, I will politely let them know this is too much for me. Let's talk about something else. I'm not going to shame and I'm not going to blame them, which is often what happens in the case of people who are suicidal. Rather than compassionately listening to someone who's suicidal, people will immediately try to solve that person's problem. The goal, first of all, being to get them not to commit suicide. And the action of doing it is usually a bunch of platitudes. Don't be selfish. Think about your family. Don't just think about yourself. Think about the consequences. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. You're just trying to get attention. For people who may routinely struggle with suicidal thoughts and may need to often call someone for help, these people will be shamed even worse. You're just looking for attention. You know, you need to stop crying wolf. If you commit suicide, you're going to go to hell. I consider this to be an extremely disrespectful, devoid of love manner in which many Christian people use to, in a very dishonest and in a manner that is not forthright, try to shame and blame someone and scare someone into not committing suicide. Well, if you commit suicide, you're going to go to hell. Frightening that someone would attack someone like that who is struggling. And the reality is, when someone is suicidal and they call someone, they don't want to commit suicide. They're not looking for advice. They're looking for someone to compassionately listen so they can express their thoughts. But what I have found, both as someone who has attempted suicide, someone who has been suicidal, and at least once called someone when I was suicidal, as well as I've had loved ones who have committed suicide, I find that way of interacting with people who are struggling with suicide to be horrifying, absolutely outrageous. It's interesting that how compassionate listening can really just be a catalyst for a person not wanting to commit suicide. The fact that they're able to get all of those thoughts out and work on the solution on their own because someone was willing to listen compassionately, saying, oh my gosh, you're going through so much, I get why you're feeling that way, I'm so sorry you're going through all that. That's compassionate listening. That's listening to their emotions and saying, I'm sorry you're feeling bad. That's not giving advice or interjecting your thoughts other than compassion. It is okay to express compassion, but not interrupting with platitudes. It's interesting that more than one person has been saved from serial killers through compassionate listening. One woman needing to get it to a certain place hitchhiked, and the guy she hitchhiked with was a serial killer, and something about luck came up, and she said, well, with my luck, she said, you're probably a serial killer. And he's told her, well, if that's your luck, then today's your lucky day. And sadly, she had been picked up by a serial killer. He took her out to the middle of nowhere. This guy was a big guy. She knew she could not escape, and she just decided to listen to him. And she asked him, why are you doing this? Why do you do this? Because she already knew she was going to die. She knew she was going to die. So she figured, why not just talk to him and listen and try to understand why? And he talked about all of his issues. It is very true that most serial killers have been through a lot of crap growing up. I'm not justifying serial killers. But she listened to him, and as a result, she became humanized. And he wound up letting her go. And she wound up saving who knows how many people's lives, because obviously she turned him in, and no more women were killed. People have been saved from serial killers through compassionate listening. Compassionate listening has the power of life and death. And the way she described that she listened to him, it was compassionate listening. It was compassionate listening. There's pitfalls to compassionate listening. Sadly, if you compassionately listen to someone, because people in our society don't listen. Listening is not a part of what we're taught in the schools. It's not a part of most people's upbringing. So sadly, if you listen the way I've described, many people will mistake your listening for your being inferior to them. They will think that your listening to them compassionately means that you are impressed by them, that you agree with everything that they have to say, that everything they say is factually correct, and that you just look up to them. And I've had people who I've compassionately listened to, and then I wanted to talk because I had just as many issues, and they were hyper vigilant on constantly interrupting me, constantly giving me platitudes and cliches for advice, and really elevating themselves above me, as though you listen to everything that I had to say because you know I'm right with everything I have to say, and I know so much. So clearly, you know you're inferior to me and you must take my advice. It was a shock. This happened to me over and over and over again. If notice, they don't have to accept these principles. So yeah, if you disagree with me and you don't want to apply these, it's fine. I know that some people submissives who would apply this in the work situation with a boss, their working relationship improved. They wouldn't apply it with me because I wasn't considered their equal, and because of classism as well as bigotry against people with mental illness, they couldn't listen to me, but they could do it for their boss, to their boss, and it improved their work relationship. If you want to work this kind of listening in that way, so be it. So be it. People have applied this, by the way, in their personal relationships, where suddenly they begin to listen to their wife, or suddenly they begin to listen to their husband. And a lot of times that improves the relationship because they're not interrupting and invalidating. And all the BS that I talked about, where people listen with their mouth, not with their ears, mind, heart, face, eyes, and with a legitimate amount of interest. So upon listening to their partner compassionately, that relationship begins to improve particularly when it's symbiotic, when both partners are doing it. It's really draining for it to be one way. Okay? Compassionate listening doesn't really apply when people are working on a project at a job. When people are trying to come up with a solution, there should be some banter and some disagreement, and there should be some coming together. So compassionate listening doesn't apply in every situation. Now, I've had boyfriends who I practiced compassionate listening to, and they wouldn't do it back. They would not. They had to give advice and interrupt constantly and tell me how I should feel, and all the BS I said where they listened with their mouth. And I remember telling some of them, one in particular, you like the way I listen to you, right? Do you like the way I listen to you? Yeah, I do. You listen. You're a great listener. I love the way you listen to me. I say, why don't you do that to me? And they would say, well, basically they didn't know how. They didn't have motivation to discipline themselves to listen. But we would get caught up in really weird arguments where they would say, well, you don't have to listen to me like that. If you want to interrupt and give me your opinion and your comparisons and all that stuff, then go ahead. I like that. I don't make you do that. Yeah, I don't make you listen the way you listen. And if you talk to me about your problems, I'm going to give you my opinion, period. And if you don't want my opinion or my input, then don't share any of your problems with me. And they would even come up with the whole BS of, I like it when people interrupt me. I like when people give me their opinions. And I like when people disagree. I would tell them, why is it that when you just talked for basically a half an hour straight and I didn't interrupt you at all, why didn't you stop and say, Neon, why aren't you interjecting? Why aren't you disagreeing? Why aren't you giving me your opinion and the solution to these issues that I'm talking about? If you wanted me to interrupt and be a bad listener, why didn't you ask me to do that? You know, they just wanted to win. They wanted to have a compassionate listener, but they wanted to not have to return compassionate listening to me. It's a crazy argument because what they said made no sense. With these listeners, sometimes I would get revenge and I would start doing the same thing, interrupting and interjecting, and they would get pissed off. So they would hopefully get my point that not listening good is not a good thing if you want to be with someone. And they would say, you're just doing that to get even with me. And I'd be like, yeah, and I'm doing it so that you get the point that this is not listening. You don't listen with your mouth. So, I had said this before. Many subs have offered money. They've offered to pay for sessions. I refuse to accept it. And because of classism and bigotry against people with mental illness, I was just not valued. I was not valued. My sessions were valued, but me as a human being, I was not valued. So there was no way they were going to listen to me talk about my problems because they were superior to me. Too many of us, in order to feel like we're somebody, we need to feel like we're better than somebody else. And almost anybody in the working class, but definitely in the middle class and above, they think people on SSI are inferior. We're losers. We're not to be talked to. You know, I used to think the same way about people who are homeless, and it's not true. And so these submissives would not respect me. I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse, but it's just interesting that compassionate listening is so difficult. And when it's compounded by classism and bigotry against people with mental illness, people who want what I can offer during a session, they would want it bad enough to offer hundreds of dollars, to offer nice little gifts, which I knew for some of them weren't really that nice. Even their gifts were somewhat classist because they knew that for someone who lives really poverty class, for me this was something I could never afford, but I knew they could afford better than what they were offering. It didn't really matter. If they offered a luxury vehicle with the title, I wouldn't have accepted it. Yes, people have offered full use of their vehicles. I've had a lot of crazy offers, but I'm still looking for that submissive that will do compassionate listening and treat me like the worthy dom that I am. This concludes the series, part 6. Like, subscribe, share, comment, commercials, recommend my videos if you like this video. Thank you. Best wishes.